It gives me great pleasure to introduce our last talk of the day at this joint Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology and Consortium for Socially Relevant Philosophy of in Science and Engineering online symposium. Our last speakers today are Katie Plaisance and Kevin Elliott. Katie's from University of Waterloo and Kevin is from Michigan State University. And they're going to talk to us, as you can see, about a framework for analyzing broadly engaged philosophy of science. So please give your attention to Katie and Kevin.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm Katie, and I'm going to be kicking off our talk today, and then I will hand it off to Kevin to give you more details about our account. So as Matt said, we are going to be sharing with you our framework for analyzing broadly engaged philosophy of science. And I'm happy to say that this paper is now forthcoming in Philosophy of Science, so it will be available at some point this fall. Okay, so as we know from being here and from hearing the talks today, there's obviously a growing interest in both socially and scientifically engaged philosophy of science. We see this with the proliferation of centers and workshops in organizations like the ones represented here today, along with actual engaged work that folks are doing through the Public Philosophy Network, engagedphilosophy.com, and other initiatives. So Kevin and I ourselves do engage philosophy of science in a number of different ways. We collaborate with scientists ourselves, and we also reflect on what it means to do engage philosophy of science. And so what we want to talk today about is, what does engagement actually mean? So what are the key aspects of engagement? How might we break them down to better understand them? And how might such analysis of engagement help to promote and support doing engaged work as philosophers of science? So in this talk, we propose a broad framework for engagement that encompasses several different approaches. Sometimes these get labeled as embedded humanities or embedded philosophy, applied philosophy, collaborative work, public philosophy, as seen in the Public Philosophy Network, field philosophy, or engaged philosophy or engaged philosophy of science. So this framework then emphasizes the process of engagement itself, and in particular, the different forms that engagement can take. So just to provide you with a bit of background, our framework is really building on a lot of the scholarship that we've seen over the last decade or so on engaged philosophy of science. So to just give you an idea of what that terrain looks like, I'm going to talk about three main frameworks. So one is work that I actually did with Carla Fair in 2010, where we co-edited a special issue of Synthesa on making philosophy of science more socially relevant. And in the introduction to that special issue, we laid out this idea of what socially relevant philosophy of science might look like. And the aspects of it were included things like looking at socially relevant topics. So research on race and genetics in philosophy of science would count as socially relevant philosophy of science. Work that engages particular stakeholder groups, and that in particular, the work that contributes to public welfare. So it was a very broad account that was intended to capture work that was actually engaging other stakeholders, as well as work that might have been looked more like traditional philosophy of science, but was engaging with more socially relevant topics. A few years later, Cartier and Potocznik put out a special issue of Erkenntnis, laying out a slightly more restrictive account that they call socially engaged philosophy of science. This also has the aim of improving human welfare, but unlike SRPoiSE, really emphasized that the work being done in CVMST had to be specifically targeted towards and accessible to relevant stakeholders. So this, one way to think about this is that this would be sort of a subset of the SRPoiSE work, where the focus is specifically on engagement. And on their account, the aim of having an impact on in the social sphere is primary to doing CVMST work, whereas one might not necessarily need to have that aim in SRPoiSE. And then finally, we have field philosophy, which on the one hand is broader than both SRPoiSE and CVMST because it is not just looking at philosophy of science, but philosophy more generally, though a lot of the focus tends to be on philosophy of science. But in another way, it's actually more narrow. So we see like these accounts getting a little bit more restrictive, where field philosophy really focuses on addressing real-world problems of non-disciplinary stakeholders. And in particular, those problems need to be defined by and guided by the stakeholders. So this, again, might be a subset of SRPoiSE, where in SRPoiSE, you could have work that is engaging with broader stakeholders, but it's still primarily directed by the philosophers. But for field philosophy, the direction needs to come more from the stakeholders themselves. Okay, so Kevin and I had been talking about this work and looking at the sort of similarities and differences between them. And what we're primarily interested in is not offering another account to sort of build on these, but to actually take a step back and say, you know, what are the ways in which these different accounts are similar and different, and how might we fruitfully analyze them so we can get sort of a bigger picture understanding of the nature of engagement that's going on in these different accounts. So we advance the scholarship in several ways. So number one, we emphasize that engagement comes in a matter of degrees. So it's not a question of, is this engaged philosophy of science or is this not engaged philosophy of science, but to what extent and in what respects is this actually engaged? Secondly, we, as Kevin is going to talk about in detail, we analyze two key dimensions of engagement and how these different dimensions can help us differentiate various approaches that philosophers of science doing engaged work might take. Third, and then I'll come back in and talk about these last two here, we highlight the interconnected aspects of engagement. So while our focus is on the forms that engagement take, we do come back later on and show how the aims one has for their work, the partners they engage with, the barriers they experience, the outcomes they will likely achieve, and potentially the long-term impacts are all intertwined with one another. And through this framework, we then start to demonstrate how different forms of engagement actually come with different challenges or barriers and different strategies to overcome them. And so we'll come back and take a look at this at the end with an eye towards some sort of practical advice as to how philosophers of science might want to start thinking about the work that they're doing in order to better or more proactively consider the potential challenges that might arise for them in order to sort of maximize the benefits and minimize the barriers to doing engaged work. So as I said, Kevin is going to talk about the first parts of our framework, and in particular, the really sort of, I think, philosophically interesting part about the different dimensions of engagement, and then I'll come back later and discuss what the implications of this might be. So Kevin, I'll leave it to you.
Great, thanks, Katie. As Katie emphasized, we really wanted to provide a framework for thinking about engaged philosophy of science that didn't just focus in on one kind of engagement, but that could help us to think about the range of different forms that engagement could take. So we started with a very basic kind of core conception of what engagement involves, which is that it involves connecting with someone or something, ideas or methods or models, whatever it might be. And so when we're thinking about engaged philosophy of science, the idea is engaged philosophy of science involves some sort of connections outside the discipline with people outside the discipline or ideas of various sorts outside the discipline. And so then, as Katie noted, we're suggesting that it can be fruitful to think about different forms of engagement in terms of two dimensions. That one dimension could be what kind of social interaction there is and to what degree with people outside the discipline. And then the other dimension is the extent to which there's epistemic integration of ideas or methods or models or concepts from outside philosophy of science with these epistemic elements from within philosophy of science. And as she noted, an important part of our framework is that both of these dimensions come in degrees. And so you can actually represent these in terms of a figure. And you can go ahead and move to the next slide, Katie. She's the one in charge of our slides here. In terms of this figure with 4 quadrants. And so the thought is that you can sort of picture different forms of engagement as fitting in different places on this figure. So we're representing the dimension of social interaction along the x-axis. So if one's really not interacting socially with people outside the discipline, their work would lie towards the left end of the the x-axis. If there's a lot of collaboration socially with people outside the discipline, it would fall toward the right end of the x-axis. And then in terms of epistemic integration, if primarily the work that's being done involves concepts and ideas from within the philosophy of science, it would fall toward the bottom of the y-axis. And if there's a lot of integration with ideas from outside the discipline of philosophy of science, it would lie toward the top end of the y-axis. And so just a couple things I'd point out about this figure before we move on. You can think about work that's really not engaged outside the discipline as falling to the bottom left portion of the figure, but then we're not drawing a sharp separation saying, this work is not engaged and this work is engaged. We're pointing out that there's kind of a continuum along these axes where you can move toward more engaged work. And another point that we would make is that we're not suggesting that everybody should be trying to do work that's at the far upper right end of the figure, a point that Katie is going to be bringing out later on. And that we want to sort of emphasize throughout the talk is that depending on the partners one's working with, depending on one's aims, the barriers that one's working with, different forms of engagement in different places on this figure may make the most sense. And so that's a central part of what we're trying to emphasize. So on the next slides, we start looking at these two dimensions. So starting with, this is what we're representing on the x-axis, the extent to which engagement efforts involve social interaction. And one of the things we wanted to do with this project is to make philosophers of science more aware of some really cool other bodies of literature that can help us in thinking about our engaged work. And so one body of literature that was interesting to read more about as we worked on this was work on engaged scholarship more broadly. And some of this work that we looked at highlighted different aspects of social interaction. So one aspect that people will discuss in terms of engaged scholarship is the extent to which it involves reciprocity or mutuality between different groups. So to what extent is information being passed back and forth between those doing the engaging, and to what extent is there kind of a sharing of control over a project versus one individual or group primarily taking control over scholarship. And then another element of social interaction that came up in this literature is what this piece by Doberneck and others called the intensity of the interaction. So they characterize this in terms of the frequency with which people involved in engaged work were interacting, the length of the interaction, and what they called the kind of complexity of the interaction. And so building on this scholarship that we found, we're suggesting that it may be fruitful to characterize when one's trying to think of where to place a particular example of engagement along the x-axis. You can look at three elements of the engagement. One would be the frequency and length and intensity of how long this engagement took place, how often the philosophers of science are interacting with others outside the discipline, and so on. Then a second element is the extent to which there's bidirectional information flow between those involved in the engagement effort. And then the third would be the extent to which there's joint control over the project. And we would acknowledge, if you wanted a really fine-grained account of different kinds of engagement, you could break these up and have each one of these be a separate sort of dimension. But we think that you then potentially lose something in terms of the complexity of having all these different dimensions. So we decided to include these together under one dimension of social interaction. And admittedly, you're kind of weighing these different elements to some extent, deciding where to place a particular engagement effort along our x-axis. So we can turn to the next slide, which the y-axis represents the level of epistemic integration occurring in an engagement exercise. And here we pull from some really cool literature on knowledge integration, which honestly, Katie's much more of an expert on than I am. But this work, there's a nice piece by Michael O'Rourke and others that we pulled from, as well as some others that we discuss here. And some of this work characterizes integration in terms of the degree to which knowledge and practices are being combined and then the durability of the changes produced. So is there a way in which these knowledge and practices are actually coming together and remaining together in new ways in the future, as opposed to just for one single project? And a lot of you are probably somewhat familiar with the terminology of multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity. So we use these terms to characterize these different degrees to which there can be epistemic integration along the y-axis. So at the bottom, would be work that's just strictly within the philosophy of science. Then you could have multidisciplinary work where there's kind of a sharing of ideas or concepts or information across disciplines, but there's not really sort of a transformation of the work being done within philosophy of science and other disciplines or perspectives. And then interdisciplinary work would involve a greater level of integration. You're moving farther up the y-axis, where there's sort of an adjusting and altering of the practices of disciplines in that regard. And then to the extent that you get to a transdisciplinary work, you're actually transforming, potentially coming up with new methods, ways of generating knowledge and co-creating knowledge. And I would mention that these terms fit really nicely when you're thinking about epistemic integration across different academic disciplines, but we don't want to focus just on engagement with other academic disciplines. So we think that you can also be thinking about this kind of integration between philosophers of science and other groups outside the academy. And so, like with the social interaction, when it comes to epistemic integration, we're suggesting, based on this previous literature that I just mentioned, that one can assess the degree of integration along the y-axis based on the extent to which epistemic elements, whether they be methods or concepts or theories or models, to the extent to which they're being transformed, would move an example of engagement farther up the y-axis. The extent to which there are persistent changes in epistemic practices as a result of an engagement effort, and the extent to which new epistemic insights are being generated that would guide future practices. So to return then to our figure with this information, our thought is that hopefully this can provide a helpful framework for then thinking about different engagement efforts and where they might fit on this framework. And then ultimately one could think about what kinds of engagement would be most fruitful given particular goals, given particular partners and barriers and strategies and so on. So in our paper, which I think, while it's actually officially coming out this fall, I think you can access it online at this point if you're wanting to read more. In the paper, we discuss several different, 4 or 5 different exemplars in different quadrants of the figure. For the sake of time here, we're just presenting 2, just to kind of give you a sense of how this can work. And so we want to give an example of Nancy Tuana's engaged work, which we would characterize as involving a high level of epistemic integration and a high level of social interaction. And then you'll see that we have another slide looking at Adam Briggle's work, which wouldn't involve as much epistemic integration. And by offering these 2 examples, we hope to point out that one can be doing really valuable work that falls in different quadrants. So actually, another example we offer in the paper is Kristen Schrader-Frechette has done work that falls in various places on this quadrant, but we give an illustration of some of her work that's actually sort of in the lower left quadrant, perhaps, that doesn't involve as much social interaction or epistemic integration, but still is valuable for society, we would suggest. So anyway, so we can turn then to Nancy's slide. Thanks, Katie, for going back for a sec there. And so Nancy, has she was the director of the Rock Ethics Institute at Penn State University for a number of years, and as the director, she organized some really great work with a group of climate scientists at Penn State. Penn State has a really strong group. You may be familiar with Michael Mann, especially as a well-known climate scientist there. And as part of this engaged work that she did collaborating with these scientists, she helped them identify values embedded in their models, these value-laden aspects of the models. And one of my favorite aspects of this was pointing out ways in which some climate models might not disaggregate information about future climate effects based on the effects on on gender, men versus women, or different socioeconomic groups, and so on, and just highlighting the significance of actually doing that kind of disaggregation. But they looked at various aspects of the models and thinking about the ethical implications of this. And we would point out that this work involved a lot of social interaction. This was a long-term collaboration. It involved, as we note on the slide, frequent face-to-face meetings with the scientists. There was a lot of joint passing of information back and forth, and a lot of joint control over this project. And then there's a lot of epistemic integration involved in this project, because the scientists were actually changing the way they were doing their modeling based on their interaction with Nancy and other philosophers. And then the philosophers, Nancy was developing new concepts involving coupled ethical and epistemic issues. She also, with some others, wrote a paper broadening our conception of research ethics to involve more than kind of traditional conceptions of ethical issues related to authorship or mentoring and so on, but thinking about these kinds of roles of values in methodology as part of research ethics. So we think this is a nice example towards the upper right part of the framework. And we would also point out that this was work being done with other academics. So some folks might characterize engaged work as as Katie pointed out earlier, as needing to involve those outside the academy. But in our efforts to provide a really broad framework, we're not making that presumption that in this case, Nancy was engaged with those outside or within the academy, but others might do engaged work with those outside. So to consider an example outside, on our next slide, we have Adam Briggle's work. And so he's a philosopher at the University of North Texas, and has done really interesting work with public stakeholders outside the academy. He was part of an effort to develop the Denton Stakeholder Drilling Advisory Group. So the University of North Texas is based in Denton, Texas, and there's a lot of fracking, hydraulic fracturing going on in that area. And so he was working with other community members to look at these issues, and they developed this group to help advise the city council. And ultimately, they ended up campaigning for a ban on fracking within the city limits. And so he talks about this effort in this book, A Field Philosopher's Guide to Fracking. And what you can see is that the social interaction was really high. So, in terms of the x-axis, it's really far toward the right on our framework. He spent years meeting with other citizens on this group. They organized public workshops and events. They met with community members to discuss these issues. He really was not running the show. He was collaborating. There's lots of joint control over this and passing of information. But in our analysis, the level of epistemic integration wouldn't be as high. That our understanding of the work was that he wasn't really trying to develop a dramatically sort of dramatic integration of ideas, but was using philosophical tools to clarify the issues at stake, bringing to the fore some of the ethical issues and conceptual issues at play, and then presenting them in a way that was really accessible at meetings, in blogs, essays, and in his book, and creating venues to hearing and clarifying these different perspectives. And so our point would be that in this case, it was really highly appropriate to be doing this kind of engaged work. It fit the goals of what he was up to really well. And, it wasn't necessary to have such, engagement that involved a particularly high level of epistemic integration in this case. So I will pass things back over to Katie, and she'll elaborate further on our framework.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So now that we have a better idea of the key dimensions of engagement that Kevin just talked about around social interaction and cognitive integration, we'd like to just highlight some ways in which we think this could be used both in terms of advancing scholarship on engaged philosophy of science, in thinking further about things like the barriers and strategies for success, but also in thinking about some practical strategies that individual philosophers of science might take. And in particular, in helping people think through sort of more proactively how different forms of engagement that they might use will lead to these different kinds of challenges, which can be really useful for then being able to sort of head those off at the pass early on in one's project. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, if we analyze these different forms of engagement, like Kevin just showed us by looking at the frequency and intensity of the interaction, the extent to which it's collaborative, and that there's mutual decision making, and then the nature of the epistemic integration, we can start to think more about how these other factors interact with one another. So in looking at the literature that I laid out early on with SRPoiSE, and field philosophy, we noticed that the sort of key features that usually get discussed are broken down into aims or motivation for the philosopher of science doing engaged work, the particular partners they're working with, which might be, like in Nancy Tawana's case, other academics, other scientists, in Adam Briegel's case, with lay publics in many cases. And then the barriers and challenges that they face, which in Nancy Tawana's case was, for example, around co-authorship practices and having to navigate sort of publications in different venues. Whereas for Adam Briegel, I think a really different kind of challenge would be thinking about how this work would be credited sort of in terms of his academic career. I believe he may have been post-tenure when he was doing most of that work. But there definitely is some concern, I think, about those kinds of incentive structures leading to particular kinds of barriers. And then what strategies one might use to mitigate those barriers. So as an example, one of the things that Nancy Tawana put in place with Scrim was what they called a flipped model publication. So they had postdocs both in philosophy of science and postdocs in science that they would hire as members of their team. And then what they would do is, like for particular kinds of projects that they wanted to publish, they would have the philosophy postdoc, let's say, take the lead on a piece that was embedded within philosophical literature and highlighting philosophical issues around the particular project, with input from and co-authors who were members of the broader research team coming from science. And then they would flip that around where the postdoc in science would be writing something more for a scientific audience that was attuned to their particular issues, maybe focusing more on the data, etc., with the others as co-authors. So that's one of the ways that they sort of put a strategy in place to deal with the kinds of incentive structure barriers that they would have been facing. And then, of course, that leads, these different forms of engagement can have different outcomes and impacts. So as we saw with Adam Briegel's case, for example, the time that he spent was really effective in terms of actually, creating policy change and getting lay publics on board with, or actually working, I should say, not getting them on board, working with lay publics to push back against the fracking that was taking place in Texas. So there's a couple of examples that we talk about in the paper that highlight the ways that these barriers, challenges, outcomes, aims, partners can vary in these different kinds of cases of engagement. So for example, as is probably pretty obvious from the way that we laid this out, high social interaction can be quite time intensive. So like with Adam Briegel's case, he was spending years going to organizing these meetings and workshops. We also talk in the paper about Kyle White's work with, as part of and with Indigenous communities. And that also involved quite a lot of work that was organizational and bringing communities together and building trust in order to ensure that the knowledge sharing could take place in appropriate ways. So it can be really time intensive. So it's really important then to think about whether or not one's aims or goals require that the high social interaction really take place, and that they think about the nature of the partners. So for example, when working with marginalized or oppressed communities, so like some of Kyle White's work with Indigenous communities, social interaction might actually be more important for building trust and credibility in order to make sure that that work can move forward. So then there's a sort of the benefit and time spent trade-off might be different in that case versus in another case that we might see in engaged work. A second example is one where you might have an approach where there's high cognitive integration, but low social interaction. So we talk about this in the paper through the example of Ken Waters. So Ken Waters is a philosopher of biology who looked at the gene concept in molecular biology. And he spent about a year hanging out in molecular biology labs and listening to scientists talk to one another in order to develop his account of the gene concept. And so what's really interesting about Ken Waters' work is that although he was spending time with the scientists, his approach, if you think about the figure that Kevin was talking about, was actually much more towards the left end of the x-axis, where it was highly individual and not collaborative. Because as Ken Waters talks about, his goal was not actually to have reciprocal engagement. His goal was to be a silent observer and to listen to how the scientists talk, and specifically to not interfere with the work that they were doing or influence them in a particular way. And so what's really interesting about that account is that although it involved levels of high epistemic integration, it wasn't something that he felt led to particular disciplinary barriers. And the reasons for that, as we analyze in the paper, are likely because if you go back to the outputs that he was working on, they were mostly philosophical papers. So yes, the time spent was high, but the kinds of outputs that he was creating were ones that fit really well with the incentive structure of academia and philosophy more specifically. Whereas in the case of Adam Brigel, that was the outputs that he had from the work that he was doing on fracking did not fit quite so much. So as Kevin and I argue then, it's really helpful to focus less on what counts as engaged or not engaged, and more on these various dimensions and the different forms of engagement, and then how they actually advance the various aims of inquiry and practice. And so for individual philosophers of science, this is a list of questions that we came up with that might be useful to think about as you're actually doing your work. One of the things that I found in some interviews I conducted with philosophers of science was that in many cases, collaborations and engagement would happen sort of serendipitously, and was oftentimes not something that philosophers of science went into intentionally, but that the collaborative approach has sort of emerged throughout their work. And so we're actually suggesting that it might be useful in some cases to think more proactively about what are your goals and aims, what outcomes will actually help you achieve those goals, and then let that sort of drive your decisions about what partners you would need to engage with to achieve them, what barriers might arise around the time commitments, difficulty accessing particular partners, et cetera. And then what steps you could take either as an individual or that the broader philosophical community could take to address those barriers. And then so more broadly, then you can come back to the framework and look at the different dimensions and think about sort of where in this framework does it maybe make most sense for me to be approaching my work given the sort of answers I came up with to the previous questions on the framework. And one of the important things we emphasize in the paper is that these approaches, again, are as we said, often philosophers sort of change the way that they're doing things, or they change their goals throughout the process, depending on what opportunities arise. So the process of engagement can be highly iterative and can change throughout. So it's good to sort of come back and check in and say, is what I've been doing like helping me achieve my goals? Are there other particular things that might work better for these purposes? Okay, and that's it. And here's our list of references to all of the other literature that Kevin mentioned early on in the talk that we hope that you'll check out. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Katie and Kevin. We have plenty of time for questions. And it looks like our first question is going to Justin Biddle.
Hey, thanks a lot for your talk. That was really, really interesting and helpful. My question is about epistemic integration. I think I have a clear sense of social interaction, but I want to hear a little bit more about, I guess, like how you're operationalizing the notion of epistemic integration. In the case of Nancy's, it seems that like kind of uptake by another community is important, in the sense that you have this community of scientists who is, you know, they're taking up Nancy's work, and you can see that reflected in citations and publications and things like that. However, I wonder if there wasn't something similar going on in, say, like Adam's case. So is it, you know, could it have been that the community groups that he was talking to actually did sort of take up some of Adam's work, in the sense that, you know, maybe the way in which they were thinking about some of the issues was changed a little bit by the kind of concepts from moral philosophy that Adam was bringing, or maybe the way in which they advocated for certain things might have changed as a result of what Adam was doing. And there you would have a case of you would have a case of uptake. It's just not uptake that's reflected in publications. Or am I wrong about that? So anyway, can you tell me a little bit more about this epistemic integration?
Yeah, Kevin, do you want to say something first, or shall I?
Well, since I noted that you're the expert on epistemic integration, I should probably let you talk first, and then I'll throw in some thoughts. Maybe.
Okay, I'll say a little bit about that. I know you know the case of Adam's works a little bit better, so I'll say a little bit about epistemic integration, and you can talk about that. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, Justin. And I think this is one of the reasons why we advocate for a sort of more of a spectrum or continuum framework for thinking about this, because I think it's not the case that like there's epistemic integration in one and no epistemic integration in the other. I think one of the frameworks, or sort of one of the bodies of literature that was driving this for us, was the multi-intern transdisciplinary work. So there's a couple things I would say in terms of the difference between Nancy's work and Adam's work. And so one is, I think that okay, let me just think about this for a second. So if we go back to, actually, I think I can just bring this up. If we go back to the example of Nancy's work, and we look at the different features here in terms of epistemic integration, one of the things that we had that I think we didn't put on this slide actually was the different features of epistemic integration. So the transformation of epistemic elements, generating persistent change in epistemic practices, and generating new epistemic insights to guide future practices. So one of the things I would say is maybe different in the case of Tuana's work from Briggle's is that although they're both maybe changing the way that different groups look at a particular issue, or in Adam's case, advocate for it, I would argue that in Nancy's case, there are these sort of persistent changes that are taking place within the epistemic community that she is engaging with, so namely as climate scientists. And then there is an element of uptake, I think, both within that group and then the broader literature that happens, that actually can have effects on the epistemic practices more broadly amongst climate scientists. And then that can also generate new insights, such as the disaggregation work that Kevin was talking about, that itself then can lead to new sort of epistemic practices. So I would say that like the sort of the scope of what she was doing there in terms of affecting another epistemic community is different. And also, I think it's a much clearer case in Nancy Tuana's that there's a clearer epistemic community that she's engaging with, where the scientists' sort of goals are to also create new knowledge and disseminate that knowledge. Whereas in the case of the activists that Adam Briggle is working with, the goals are less about, less primarily epistemic ones and more in terms of the political action.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up this slide because I was hoping to refer to it. So, I hope it's helpful, Justin, when you were mentioning the issue of uptake, I would really place that as the second bullet point, the generating persistent changes in epistemic practices, say in a community. But we would say even if you didn't have that kind of uptake, you could still have a reasonable degree of epistemic integration if just in a particular project, the project involves this kind of alteration of normal, methods or models or that sort of thing. So this gets to the messiness of we're trying to stick these things into one dimension. And you might say, I want something more fine-grained. I want to talk about both uptake and the transformation of these epistemic elements separately. And that's just a kind of a limitation of our analysis. But another thing I would just bring up is you do make a nice point in talking about the ways in which community members may have altered the ways they were arguing or so on based on what Adam was suggesting. And so one does need to think of sort of both directions. We were noting that Adam maybe wasn't really altering, philosophical thinking, perhaps in a dramatic way. But if in fact this was really altering the way the community members were thinking, well, then that would be an argument that it needs to move up a little higher up in epistemic integration. And I think we acknowledged as we were thinking this through, it's easier to analyze, we felt like, epistemic integration when you've got a couple scholarly communities. This language of multi, inter, and transdisciplinary fits really well for that. So you might worry about the extent to which we can apply this to groups that aren't, academics. We were thinking we could, but it's probably a little bit trickier, and we would acknowledge that. And you may be pushing us on that point, rightly.
Or just that, there might be a little bit of undercounting when you're dealing with communities that like don't deal in publications and things where you can like see this really easily. But yeah, thanks.
Okay, good. Deepanwida.
Yeah, hi, Katie, Kevin, thanks for a very nice talk. And I love to see the coordinate model, the 4 quadrants of the interaction. I have a question about something that might be in between the 2 examples that you gave, Nancy Tuanas as well as Adam Briggles. So I think it will be great if that is up on the slide. Yeah. So in Nancy Tuanas' case, you give an example of scholarly exchange between 2 scholars, and I understand from Katie that postdocs are included in the scholarly community, and the other in the stakeholders. But I'm curious to know where you place science teaching, because that's a crucial aspect of this. And let me describe very quickly something that I and some of my chemistry colleagues have been trying to do since last fall, this spring. We'll continue to do it. Last year, one of my students, who is also a chemistry student but took a couple of philosophy courses, he asked me that, is there any other way of teaching chemistry except through physics? Because the physics is there to provide all the justification. If you look up an OpenStax textbook, it is atomic theory, periodic table, nuclear chemistry, that's like that. Then everything is described in terms of it. But he said that he's interested in chemistry, but not so much in physics, and how chemistry could be taught from a human point of view. So, not knowing anything about it, I started talking with a couple of chemistry professors, and here's the idea we came up with, to create little modules for teaching. These are not for experts. These are undergraduate students, maybe even high school, organized around a particular question, like the temperature of the milk. Why is it that drinking warm milk helps you to get back to sleep? And the explanation for that apparently lies in some kind of bonding, atomic bonding. So we decided to create tiny modules, maybe 2-week modules, around this bunch of questions. And they could be available, and we'll launch it through a website. And one of my colleagues is now trying to design a kind of semi-circular console where you could have an immersive experience. So this seems to be kind of half in between all your quadrants. So what you put these kind of teaching efforts that are not meant for the professionals, not for the research scholars, but anybody who has some kind of scientific curiosity, wants to do a good job of decision making, where do those things fall in your quadrant?
Do you want to start, Katie, or should I?
I was going to say, do you want to start this time? And then I can follow up.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, I think that's really interesting. I love that you're bringing up a different kind of engagement effort that we can think about. And I guess the way I would approach it is, say, first, you could think about along the x-axis if we're thinking about your work in this, I would want to look at, okay, well, what does your social interaction look like with your colleagues in doing this? You're obviously talking with them, meeting, discussing this. It seems like they're providing ideas, maybe you're providing ideas. And so to that extent, it sounds like it's, moving a ways across the x-axis toward being collaborative.
Right.
And then I think it's a really interesting question how to characterize this along the y-axis. Again, maybe this fits with Justin's question, arguing that it's easier to think about the social interaction, the epistemic integration can be complicated. But I think we would want to think both from a philosophical perspective, how is this sort of potentially altering the way philosophers of science would be thinking? And then from the perspective of those you're collaborating with, how is this potentially affecting the way they would be thinking or operating or modeling? And maybe, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear what Katie might think. I think you're nicely bringing up what's complicated about this case is there's the philosophy of science, there's the science, and then there's the way, other groups are thinking, those that you're teaching. And so I guess we need to think about those different areas of thought. But what we would want to look at is how much kind of change in these sort of ways of thinking by these different communities, to what extent are they being changed, and over what length of time, to what extent are new ways of thinking being developed in these different from these different perspectives. But I don't know, Katie, how would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I like what you said. I think one thing I would add is considering the students as the community with which you're engaging, as the stakeholders. And now I really want to think this through more with the student example, because I really do think that there's a difference when you're, so even one of the things that comes to mind is in the Synthesa issue that Carl and I co-edited, Heather Douglas had a paper in there about the difference between applied philosophy that's like off the shelf and applied versus engaged philosophy that's on the ground. And I really like that distinction and it's one of the things I always think about when I'm teaching, or I think about when philosophers of science are teaching STEM students or science education students, for example. It's really important to take an approach that's less of the sort of applied off the shelf. Like if you're teaching them about ethics and science, maybe like, let's learn Kant and then apply it. Let's learn this and apply. Might not be the best approach. It depends on really what you're trying to do, but starting from the particular problems that they're grappling with, and then showing sort of how the philosophical issues arise from there might actually be a better approach. So I do think there's a way in which when you're teaching, so either with your maybe scientists, co-teachers, or with the students, or both, I do think that there's a sort of a spectrum again in terms of how much you're sort of doing this less of a back and forth interaction with the students versus a more collaborative approach. So for example, even in my own teaching, I have a class that I would say is even on our framework would be all the way to the right on the x-axis, where there's almost equal control, where the students and I collaborate to design the entire course from the very beginning, including all the assignments, etc. So so if I think about what Adam Briegel's doing with stakeholders, I think about that very similarly. Also, I would say that I've seen, I think if I think about the epistemic integration, when I first started teaching as a philosopher coming into this interdisciplinary program, I was teaching in a way that probably would have been lower on the y-axis, where I'm sort of focusing on philosophy of science and taking things from philosophy of science as the starting point. And then as I have all these interdisciplinary students and I'm bringing things in from different fields, it's really kind of going up. So I think that, there's a way in which you can tell a similar story using this framework that I actually hadn't thought about when we're thinking about teaching. That could be really interesting as well. I just think it'd be important to distinguish between something similar or different might be going on when you're thinking about the potential co-instructors, or scientists you're working with versus your actual students.
So given what both of you said, I have a quick follow-up. So it seems that thinking in one way, our project is top right hand, but it is very different from Nancy Twinner's project. From another, we are at the right hand side bottom, but it is very different from Adam Briggle's project. So I wonder whether your model could actually be dynamic rather than having a fixed coordinate, if it can just move up and down depending on the process and the moment.
Absolutely.
Because
I
what
mean, one of the things we do in the paper is we actually talk about two examples in the same quadrant just to show how different they can be. So we compare both Nancy Tuana's work with SCRIM to Kyle White's work with Indigenous communities and scientists. And we show that, look, these are both in the upper right corner, but they're engaging with different partners. They're doing it in different ways. They have different aims. They have different outcomes. So absolutely, they can look quite different even in the same quadrant. And then I think the other point that Kevin made when he was laying this out was that we decided to look at this at the project level. So even though we have names in there, Nancy Tuana and Adam Briggle, that's really just a shorthand for like Nancy Tuana's work with SCRIM and Adam Briggle's work with fracking. Because also, as Kevin pointed out, like Christian Schrader-Frechette is somebody who we talked about as an example of her work that's in the lower left quadrant. But of course, she's really all over the place if you look at her career. So different projects of the same individual can be in different places. And then also because of the iterative nature of engagement and work, even one project can sort of move around. And in fact, that I did find that was often the case when I was interviewing philosophers, where they would sort of start off in one place, opportunities would arise, and then they would move. But I think actually, like, I would say that a framework like this would help you be more aware of the movement that's actually happening, which could help you like sort of proactively identify where you might hit some barriers and challenges. And one real world example of that in action, I think, is the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative from Michigan State. That's actually aimed at like getting people to sit down and think about these things before they collaborate. Yeah.
That sounds like a very quantum model rather than a classical model of engagement.
We have a question from John Rosenberg.
Hi, all. Thanks. I also thought that this was really interesting. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about, I guess, maybe other forms of integration that you might call, I don't know, teleological or normative, because it seems like, to a certain extent, there may be less epistemic integration at certain times, but none of these practices are just purely epistemic, right? So they have social or political or ethical norms or aims as well. And so it seems like, while the epistemic integration may be low in some of these cases with non-academic communities, other norms or other sort of structures within the practices may be much more closely aligned. And so I just wonder how you think that might fit into this. And I mean, I think it sort of follows up with what Justin and Deepanita were asking. So. Thanks.
Katie, do you have a preference?
Well, I think one of us wrote a book on values in science, and that person should be the first one to speak up.
Well, I guess, so great question, John. Really good point. As you were talking about that, I think there are a lot of ways that we could explore your point. I think it's really interesting. But what immediately came to my mind was that as a result of, interaction, say the philosophers or scientists involved in engagement, some group may, realize that they really ought to alter their goals, their aims, or, something like that. And so, one could try to set up this, account where you've got all these different kinds of dimensions where the aims are another dimension, say running, into the figure, that kind of thing. What we decided to do was, as Katie has here, what we decided to do was we would just have our basic framework involve these two dimensions of the epistemic integration and the social interaction, and then acknowledge that there are these other, so we called those the forms of engagement. And then we said you could also be thinking about the goals of the engagement. So you could categorize different kinds of efforts based on their goals. You could be thinking about the partners. So we considered, well, should the partners be part of these different dimensions? And we decided, well, we'll just have that be a separate kind of aspect to engagement, but we would just call what we're doing these different forms. And then you need to consider, okay, well, we also need to think about, the goals, the partners, the barriers, and so on, and consider how they relate to what we're calling the forms here. So I think that would be my initial thought, that we would say, you are right on target, John. We need to be thinking about those things. And we decided to conceptualize it as, okay, well, given goals at one point in time, what form of engagement might make sense. And then you realize, oh, wow, as a result of, as Katie was pointing out, the iterative nature of this, we start engaging because of this bidirectional interaction. We realize, oh man, we need to change our goals here. And then as a result of that, that might affect your forms of engagement, or it might affect who you're partnering with, or so on. So I really like your point, and there are probably different ways we could have set up the framework, but that's kind of how we thought about it. I don't know if you have.
I'll just add one thing. I mean, I'm particularly interested in thinking about much like the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, creating sort of tools and frameworks and guidelines for philosophers of science and others to think about how to approach this kind of work. And Kevin and I were trying to sort of make steps in that direction towards the end of the paper when we put this table here with the kinds of questions you might want to think about. So I would just be really interested in thinking about pushing that further. And further developing that and saying here are some questions you should be thinking about. I can even imagine this as sort of like a worksheet when you're sitting down and thinking about, one of the best points to do this is maybe thinking about a grant proposal, right, at that stage of the project. And adding that as a particular question of in what way do you think that the, values might arise, or there might be conflicts in different kinds of values as you approach this type of engagement, which might be a collaboration, which might be more observation, which might be, whatever is appropriate. So I think that would just be something that as this hopefully gets developed more in that sort of practical guideline direction, that's another factor, sort of Kevin said, in the different parts of this, I guess, not the framework that we provided with the figure, but sort of at the end here, that's one more consideration that people could take into account. I think that would be really useful.
Okay, we have just enough time to squeeze in one more question if anyone has one. Morgan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for this talk. It was really interesting. I guess I recognize that you've created just 2 dimensions that have kind of multiple dimensions among them. So I guess what you had to say about the contrast between, for example, White's kind of work and Ken Waters' work in terms of maybe Waters' work had a large frequency of interaction, but he had more control over the project, whereas White maybe had a lot of frequency of interaction and also maybe less control because he needed to build this trust with the community. Are there other kinds of relations among these kinds of sub-dimensions that might help researchers address the problems? Are there any other examples of other dimensions being a precondition or facilitating addressing certain challenges to research? I don't know if that's a clear way to understand what some of the points were, but it seems like there might be a relationship between you need maybe a high frequency of interaction and maybe less control over a project in order to develop trust that may eventually get you, for example, a transformation of epistemic elements or persistent change in another community. That's the idea, at least.
I started the last 2 answers, so if you want to jump in, Katie, feel free.
Morgan, I don't know if this is answering your question, so if it's not, let me know. But I actually, in another project that I was working on in parallel with this one with Kevin, talked about the benefits of engagement. I think it's a paper called The Benefits of Acquiring Interactional Expertise, Why Philosophers of Science Should Engage, why some philosophers of science should engage, not all, because as Kevin noted, we don't think that everybody should be doing this kind of work. But there I argued that that engaging with particular communities where you actually have these kinds of social interactions can do a number of things for you, where you don't just better understand the science. So people in, for example, the Society for Philosophy, Science and Practice oftentimes will engage with scientific communities to better understand the science and how it actually works and understand the tacit knowledge so that they can provide more accurate philosophical accounts, which is very much what Ken Waters was trying to do. But I argue there that in addition to those epistemic benefits, there's also, I guess what I would say, like as socio-epistemic benefits to that, like that engagement in and of itself does some work to signal to another community that you are invested in really understanding their perspective, that you're committed to really having an accurate viewpoint, that you're soliciting input from them, maybe are even willing to give up some element of control or co-construct knowledge with them, and that signaling, can increase your credibility, and then that increase in credibility can actually make it more likely for your input to be solicited and to be given uptake and actually lead to transformation. So I think these things can then all become intertwined. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's, for me, in my mind, I think that a lot of people can think about engagement more from the perspective of like, how can this help me better understand the science, and less about how can engagement in and of itself actually lead to an increase in the uptake of philosophical work.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add, I really like your question. I think this is a really fruitful way to be thinking. And I guess I'll just shamelessly advertise our paper. Toward the end of the paper, that we talk about some of these relationships, among these different, questions and dimensions. I'm not sure that we really fully address everything you're getting at. I think you're getting at some really interesting points, but I really like Katie's point that, one connection is the idea that in order to get uptake of ideas, epistemic integration with a scientific community, you may need more social interaction to pull that off. That's, I think, a really interesting point. And then, we point out that it may be harder to achieve epistemic integration with some communities, like, say, scientists in industry, because they may be dealing with confidential business information. And, and you rightly picked up on the idea that, Katie brought up that social interaction may be really important when you're trying to build trust with some communities. So anyway, I think there's a lot that could be said there, and I don't think we have it all figured out yet, but I really appreciate your question.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for questions. Please join me in thanking Kevin and Katie for a lovely paper and discussion. Really super interesting stuff. So now I'm supposed to make some closing remarks. I will keep them brief. It's been great to interact with you all today. I think it was quite painful last year to miss a variety of opportunities, including our 10th anniversary Values in Science Conference, and Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology Conference, and the SRPoiSE event, among other things. And I'm just glad we didn't face this a second year in a row with no VMST, no SRPoiSE interaction and face-to-face, at least virtually face-to-face dialogue about these issues. So thank you all for joining us. We now have some time on the schedule for a little bit of a reception. If you want to stick around for a little while, maybe grab a tasty beverage of some kind from your home refrigerator and join us just to chat for a bit, catch up. That would be great. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you all in real space sometime soon. Thanks to all, especially to our speakers.
Thanks so much to the organizers.